Hello and welcome everyone as we're starting to join in for our Sappy Hour tonight. I hope everyone's having a good day so far and is excited to learn all about Northern trips tonight. So we have a great group of people together with us tonight, and we're just going to let people join in, and we'll get started very shortly. All right. Should we dive right in now? All right, I got the thumbs up from Galen. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Rupert. I have been working on this Atlas project behind the scenes since the start. I am a resident of Leamington, Ontario, and I work at Point Pelee National Park. And before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I am currently on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, composed of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Specifically, this is the home of Caldwell First Nation and part of the House of Walpole Island First Nation. We acknowledge the caregivers of this land and all the moccasins that have traveled over it over time. So, I know you're here and you're dying to learn all about Northern trips. So I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight, and I'm just going to have you give a little wave just as I introduce the panels. So William Konze is here with us tonight. There's
Hello.
William. Mark Peck is here, and Mark's turned his camera off. So, but Mark Peck is here. Mhairi's here. McFarlane. Karl and Scott are all here tonight, and as well, Mike B and Mike C, of course, are along for the ride, and Kaylin's behind the scenes, making sure that everything goes well tonight. So first up this evening, we are going to be talking about the Woodland Caribou trip. So for those of you who don't know William Konze is a 21-year-old student, and I have a hard time believing you're 21 now, William. At the University of Guelph, majoring in wildlife biology and conservation, and has been an avid birder for quite a few years. This was William's first major trip for the Atlas, although last year, as part of his summer job at an ecological consulting company, he was able to complete some on-road and a few off-road point counts in the Huron and Grey counties and in the north end of Algonquin. William is also a principal atlaser for a local square near Guelph. So welcome, William. And I think you all know Mark Peck, who is a staunch fixture at the Royal Ontario Museum in the ornithology department. So I am going to pass things over to William and Mark, and we're going to learn all about the Woodland Caribou trip. So take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Let me just figure out how to, I'm going to share my screen first, and then I'll get right into it here. Okay. I'm now sharing. Oops. Oh, there we go. There we go. Can everyone see my screen here? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, well, I guess I'll get right into that. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sarah. So just to give a little bit of a summary before I get into it, our trip to Woodland Caribou Provincial Park in the northwestern corner of Ontario took place the 20th to the 30th of June of this year, and we had an awesome group of 5 people listed here, and we also brought along 2 canoes with us and all of our gear, which we loaded onto a float plane. So yeah, we were flown into a small lake in the park. We flew out of Red Lake, Ontario, and then we embarked down the Bloodvein River on a 120-kilometer long adventure. Okay, here we go. Oops. There we go. Okay, so yeah, here is our group. I'll introduce the team here. And I want to thank Mark for coming up with these very accurate nicknames. So yeah, we have veteran atlaser Mark, aka Leaky Boot Peck, Pat, aka the ARU King Kramer, Matt, Camp Master Kennel, and Sarah Zoomer Gates. And there I am as well. I'm William Leaky Tent Konze, and I'll try to get into some of the issues I had with my leaky tent later. So this was actually our first time in the field together, all of us, with the exception of Matt and Sarah. So we had to get to know each other really quite fast. And yeah, so I think this photo was taken on our, it was like our last or second last day of the trip. And I think we can all agree by this point, we were really worn out, but you can see we were still in high spirits. Yeah, so again, I wanted to say, I think I was really lucky to have this very experienced group of people along with me. I am mostly a birder and don't have a ton of backcountry canoeing experience, so having these guys along was great. Right here. Okay, so yeah, planning for this trip was no easy task. It took many online meetings and emails over a period of months before to firstly assemble our team and then to coordinate things like who would be responsible for bringing what gear, who would bring things like the canoe, and determining how much food and how many snacks we could fit with us on the plane and then in the canoe. So yeah, I'll go back to where we started. We started our journey. So actually we drove all three groups of us actually drove up from Southern Ontario to the community of Red Lake, where we caught our float plane and flew out into Woodland Caribou. It was about a 40-minute float plane in. And just to let you know, it's about a 21-hour drive to Red Lake from my community of Guelph. So it was a very long drive. And actually, luckily for me, I was able to combine this trip, with a personal birding trip for my Ontario Big Year that I'm completing this year. So yeah, for those who don't know, a big year is a challenge to see as many species of birds as possible in a single geographic location in the span of 1 year. So I actually drove up from Guelph with a friend to the Rainy River area, where we did a few days of birding, looking for Western specialties and breeding birds. And then we actually did a really quick detour into Minnesota to look for prairie chicken, because why not? We were already up there. And then I dropped my friend off at the Winnipeg airport. He flew back, and then I drove the 5 hours from Winnipeg to Red Lake. Yeah. So yeah, I was pretty exhausted even before this trip began. And I'm not sure I would pack so much in again before a very physically demanding canoe trip. And then the other two teams are Pat and Mark. They had a relatively more leisurely trip up. Mark picked Pat up in Peterborough, and then they were able to do a few mornings of atlasing on their way up. And then Matt and Sarah actually flew into Red Lake from Toronto via Sioux Lookout and Thunder Bay, I think. So that was a full day of traveling for them as well. Okay. And so to get into the trip, you can see this is a map we had along with us. We completed 5 different atlas squares, and we actually brought a lot of technology along with us on this trip. It was very essential, as the vast majority of our point counts and general atlasing data were submitted on our phones via the Nature Count app. And that's kind of a new thing for this atlas. So we had to carefully watch how often we were using our phones to preserve battery life. But luckily we had periods of sunny weather pretty much every day. So we were able to recharge our phones with solar panels. We also brought 2 ARUs, or automatic recording units, along with us, which we would set up in varying habitats and then leave for multiple hours and often overnight before coming back to collect them. and 2 Zoom units as well, which we used to ensure that we were not missing any species that we were hearing on our point counts. And then Mark and Pat brought all the equipment back, and then they were sent to the Atlas office where all the recordings were analyzed by Atlas staff. So this is just some of our gear about to be loaded on the Twin Otter float plane that we took from Red Lake. Just to point out, it was extremely, extremely hot that day. I think it was like 33 degrees. So we were just melting with all our gear, and it was really hot in the plane. So kind of had a sweaty start to the trip. So yeah, you can see in the picture, everything, including ourselves, was weighed on this big, massive scale to make sure the plane wasn't too heavy and wouldn't crash. So yeah, you can see 850 pounds of human, 500 pounds of equipment, including the 2 canoes. Okay, and here are some action shots of us on the trip. The scenery, of course, was just spectacular and is reason enough alone to want to go experience the wilderness of Northern Ontario. So for the majority of the trip, we were following the Blood Vein River, which flows through many small, relatively calm lakes. So most of the paddling was fairly easy. However, park staff had actually not been able to do any maintenance in the park since the COVID pandemic began. So it was a bit of a challenge finding our relatively few portages that we had to do. I think we spent like maybe 2 or 3 hours one time just trying to find our portage. So yeah, they were very grown over and we had to kind of clear our own path sometimes. Luckily, the portages were really, really short, so we were okay. So yeah, most of the habitat we encountered, you can see behind this photo of us in the canoe there, was recently burnt. So that actually added to our navigation challenges because the maps we had weren't really up to date. So we weren't exactly sure where we were going and what type of habitat we were going to encounter. So yeah, most of the habitat we covered was burnt pine and spruce forest, but we also got a few nice days and variety of some non-burnt forest habitats as well. And we got to spend some time in some wetlands as well, which was great. So we were actually really quite unlucky with the weather on this trip, and especially with thunderstorms. We had quite a few very kind of nerve-wracking afternoons waiting out these massive thunderstorms. It poured pretty much every single day. And I recall many trying moments sitting in my tent in the pouring rain, praying that I would not get wet. And a lot of the time I did get wet, but luckily it wasn't too bad because my other team members came to the rescue with tarps and stuff. So I was able to stay relatively dry. And this is why good rain gear and tarps are a must. And next time I will definitely make sure that my tent is not leaky before going on one of these trips. And you can see that big orange tarp covering our campsite there was really, really great. It actually took quite a few beatings throughout the trip. It had a big tree actually fall on it that we cut down because we were worried it was going to teeter and fall over on our tents. And then at the end of the trip, it finally ripped in half. So yeah. On to the next. So yeah, here are some shots of us actually doing some atlasing. So I'm going to go over quickly what kind of a typical day would look like. So we would generally wake up at around 4 a.m. and depending on our route that day, we would either pack up camp right away or come back and pack up after our morning point counts. So generally, Mark and I were a team and we'd set out together in one canoe, and Pat and Sarah were the other team in a second canoe. And generally what we do is we do our point counts, we'd finish up at around 10 o'clock, and then we would meet back at camp to a freshly made breakfast that Matt had prepared for us. So bravo to Matt again, because he was awesome. So Sarah and Mark they would be responsible for setting up the Zoom units and doing that recording. And then Pat and I would be responsible for creating our nature counts checklist on our phones and submitting that, saving that data, and then submitting that later. So yeah, after our breakfast, we would paddle a few hours. So it kind of varied how many hours we'd paddle afterwards to our next campsite. We'd set up camp, we'd eat dinner, and then we kind of have a few hours to do some exploring and relaxing before we pack it in. I think every night we didn't really stay up past sunset at all. And just to get into the point counts, most of our point counts were pretty easily accessible. Most of them were close to along the lake shore or the river. However, there were quite a few that required us to park our canoe and walk into the forest. And as you can see in that photo, I don't think you can see the cloud of black flies that are around me, but I'm sure you can imagine them. The bugs were really quite bad. At most places that were not right on the water, you would have a cloud of mosquitoes and black flies following you around everywhere. And I'd get quite used to looking down at my hands and just seeing 3 or 4 mosquitoes biting me at once. So yeah, you gotta get used to that. And I think in that picture that I took of Mark, we had some cool birds. I think we had like a palm warbler singing from that point count, and right around there is where we had a northern hawk owl. So it was exciting. And finally, we're going to get into the birds. So I'm sure this is all what everyone's looking forward to. So we had almost 100 species on our trip, including actually a new one for my big year, which was the olive-sided flycatcher in the top left corner there. We actually got quite a few of those. Mostly we just heard them, but actually I don't even know if we saw a single one, but we heard a lot. We also had lots of bald eagles. We had 3 species of owls, which were long-eared, great gray, and northern hawk owl, as well as many different species of ducks, warblers. I think the highlight for the warblers for me was hearing a Connecticut warbler on habitat. We also had spruce grouse, Canada jays, greater yellowlegs, sedge wren, both crossbills, blackback woodpeckers, which were everywhere in the burns, and common nighthawk, eastern whippoorwill as well. So yeah, we were able to confirm breeding species for actually quite a few species, including a long-eared owl, which we found sitting on a nest, and common nighthawk. One of my favorite experiences was accidentally flushing a common nighthawk off its nest. These nests, they're not really nests, they're not even scratches, they're just eggs essentially on the ground. And they're really hard to find, as the birds are so cryptic looking that the only way to find them is to flush a bird off its eggs. And experienced atlaser Mark had only ever encountered, I think, maybe 2 or 3 nests before this trip. So we were just thrilled that we were able to find 3 nests total. So that was just awesome. And some other interesting bird news for the trip was that we weren't able to find a lot of breeding evidence for many, many common species like bald eagle or common loon, or even common goldeneye. I think the only ducklings that we had were common goldeneye. So we were quite surprised. And we had lots of bald eagles I think we had about a pair of bald eagles for every little lake. And we'd see them sitting on nests, but no young at all. And same with loons. We couldn't find a single loon nest or couldn't find any young. And we never really figured out why this was, but I think the lack of breeding evidence was probably tied to the recent forest fires. So, slide. We also came across a rock wall along one lake with a lot of very elaborate Ojibwe pictographs. I'm not exactly sure how old they were, but I think hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of years old. And this was for sure another main highlight for me. And I think we were paddling by fairly early in the morning, and we were just so kind of taken aback by this awesome scene that we stopped for 10 minutes and just kind of admired it. So yeah, that was really cool. And we can finally say that we did some other stuff other than birding or paddling. We got our we got our cultural fix for the trip as well. And so yeah, often at the end of the day before we ate supper and set up camp, we'd have some time to relax. Generally the bugs made this challenging, but most of our campsites were on the lake, so we'd have a nice breeze, and the temperature was quite pleasant. So we'd just kind of hang out, and we'd often go for a swim. I think we all wish we swam a little bit more because we were quite grimy at the end of the trip. But yeah, so yeah, here I am looking very, very happy, and Matt and Sarah going for a dip there. And so finally, to conclude, here we are on the plane ride out. I know we were all very relieved to hear our float plane coming for us after waiting for it for quite a while in the canoe on this lake. And yeah, here's kind of our stats there, but to sum up, this was a truly, truly amazing experience that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And I think we really, really complemented each other. And I sure learned a lot from everyone. And yeah, be it about birds or how not to get wet in a tent. Yeah, so yeah, that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I'll stop sharing here.
All right. Well, thanks so much, William. That was a great rundown of what you guys got to do. We're going to move on to our next presenter, and we'll definitely answer any questions that anyone may have at the end. So we're going to move on to a presentation about the Muketei River trip, and this is with Mhairi McFarlane, and she is the Director of Science and Stewardship for the Ontario region of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it's an important job. She oversees stewardship of the NCC properties throughout Ontario and landscape scale planning for property acquisition. She grew up in Scotland, holds an honors ecology degree from the University of Stirling, and a PhD in ecology from the University of Exeter in Cornwall, England. Her thesis was on the behavioral ecology of Cape sugar birds in South Africa. She has been atlasing in Middlesex County, Wabakimi Provincial Park, and this past summer did the atlasing trip that she's going to tell us all about now. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Mhairi. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to all of you on the great wide internet for joining us tonight. Hopefully you guys can see my screen okay. Can you give me a thumbs up or otherwise, Kaylin? Yeah,
that's good.
Thanks. Awesome. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the experiences and give you a little bit in the way of kind of tips and tricks about gear and bits and pieces like that to kind of follow up from William's presentation. So we were out from the 15th to the 26th of June this past summer. So peak bug o'clock again, that is a recurring theme. My slides are not advancing, there we go. So we were right up here on the Muketei River, so that's around 53 degrees north, and for context, I'm sure many of you are calling in from kind of GTA area, so down there where I live in London, it's about 43 degrees north, so we're good 10 degrees north of where we tend to hang around. This is, again, the reference there for finding information about Indigenous lands in Ontario and beyond. It's Cree lands under the James Bay Treaty 9, and you can read all about that on that web link there. So it was a huge privilege to be able to visit these lands and spend some time here and learn a little bit about the amazing natural history that you can stumble across. So you heard a little bit about me already. So as you've already heard, I grew up in Scotland. That's why I talk funny. I did a PhD in South Africa on birds and then moved to London, Ontario in 2006. And the point of this is really that although I am a professional conservation biologist, then you don't actually need to be in order to do one of these really amazing atlasing trips or to contribute to the atlas from wherever you happen to be in the province over the next few years. Obviously it helps, but with all the information on the website and people like myself and others on the call, we're always here to give you advice and support. Another point here is that I only actually started canoeing on appropriately enough Canada Day 2020. So I really didn't know which end of the paddle to hold before then. I could probably work it out, but don't have a huge amount of experience. But the pandemic has in some ways given us this amazing opportunity to learn how to do this thing that many of you who grew up in Canada will have been doing all of your lives. So despite having a relatively short experience of these things, we pulled off a pretty successful atlasing trip this past June, which I'm going to touch on just now. So again, the fun, exciting stuff I'm sure you all want to see a lot about the birds, and you're probably all itching to go out and contribute to these trips because of the birds, and that is a really good objective. For me, I got 2 lifers and an Ontario tick, so I'd never seen American three-toed woodpeckers before. I found a nest and got to watch the adults feeding repeatedly, which was a really incredible experience. We heard Connecticut warblers on quite a few point counts, which was new for me, and I'd never seen Arctic terns in North America before. So these were really cool experiences that really contributing to one of these atlasing trips gives you the opportunity to get these really cool bird experiences. I get a huge kick out of seeing shorebirds standing in trees, and there was no shortage of shorebirds standing in trees, mostly standing in trees yelling at us. Despite our best efforts not to disturb birds, of course, then yellowlegs, both greater and lesser yellowlegs, I think they probably heard our alarm clocks and started alarming at us when we were still kilometers away, it felt like. It was a real privilege to spend time in both of these species habitats. We didn't manage to find any nests, but there was certainly a lot of agitated breeding codes being used on our point counts. We also came across this least sandpiper. She actually had a couple of incredibly cute little fluffy chicks scuttling around on a particularly wet point count location. So I had to kind of keep moving my feet so I didn't sink into the bog doing the point count here. And there she was with these tiny little chicks. So those are just some kind of fun birdie highlights that you can expect to also be lucky enough to see on these trips. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the skill sets that you might want to pick up on before embarking on a trip like this. So we'd done a wilderness first aid course beforehand, which gave us quite a lot of peace of mind that we knew, at least in theory, hopefully not in practice. Well, hopefully in practice, but we hope to not have to put it into action. We'd be able to assess injuries and illnesses and things that you would come across in a field context like this, and hopefully be able to do kind of at least a bunch of stuff to keep people comfortable and safe. We'd also done some whitewater instruction on the particular trip that we did on the Muketei River. This photo here is probably the most exciting rapid that we came across, which was still really quite straightforward. But it was really comforting knowing that we had some whitewater skills under our belts, despite being pretty new to paddling. And you can pick these up at places like Paddler Co-op and the Madawaska Canoe Centre, and I'm sure there are others. And if you're looking at embarking on an atlasing river trip, then it's a really good idea to try and sign up for one of those courses and give yourself a bit more confidence if you don't already have those skills. The other thing that, for those of you that maybe haven't done much kind of wilderness or backcountry camping, then that is certainly something that it can take a little bit of time to get your head around what that really means. And we've already heard from William with his leaky tent, and things like that can end up being really quite hard to deal with if you've not kind of spent time in the wilderness before, or not spent multiple nights under canvas in places where you might be an expensive plane ride away from help or from backup gear. And following on from that, then you need to be able to kind of pack what you need. Everything that you need needs to fit on the scales and fit into that plane. So you need to have a little bit of redundancy in your gear and a little bit of kind of playing it safe in terms of, simple things like how many pairs of socks do you need and what kind of layers do you need, but also thinking about some, equipment and backup equipment for things that you really don't want to go without if you lose it or break it or something like that. So if these things are things that you haven't already done that much of, then it's worth trying to carve out some time to do a little bit of backcountry stuff and pick up some of these skill sets before embarking on one of these trips. And although with all of those kind of training and experience and skill sets and so forth, then things still happen, and it's worth making sure that you're in kind of the right frame of mind and with the right experience to actually deal with things that might happened to go wrong. So the top left is a photo I happened to take. We were feeling quite pleased with ourselves. We'd set up our camp. It was lovely and calm. It was, reasonably flat. We had lots of space. We could set up the 2 tents, or 3 tents, in fact, and the bug tarp, and just having a bite to eat. And then those black clouds turned into a giant thunderstorm, which basically flattened our camp. And the photo in the bottom right is not quite what the storm did. We did kind of dismantle a bunch of stuff in a hurry and get everything kind of cut and done. And the only casualty to that whole storm event was actually one of the poles for the bug tarp buckled under the force of the wind. So it wasn't nearly as serious as it could have been, but things like this happen, and in a wilderness situation, then you do need to be prepared to deal with things like that. So fortunately, it gave Brent and George an excuse to go off and kind of find a giant stick and carve it and make a pointy end and basically replace a tent pole with a lump of tree that they found down the river. So just a simple little example of something that could have been a lot worse, but because we were kind of prepared, we were really proactive at pulling the camp down when the storm hit. We didn't actually have anything go wrong in any kind of a way that really impacted the rest of our trip. You've already heard a little bit about bugs. There were definitely some bugs. The bugs were bad, sometimes very bad, sometimes extremely bad, and sometimes even apocalyptic. But with some good gear, you can actually deal with these situations really and be remarkably comfortable. So we essentially lived in our bug jackets for most of the time. The majority of the time, the hoods were zipped up and the mesh was down over our faces. We wore work gloves on our hands with some fingertips cut off, so we could still kind of write things down and use phones and cameras and things. And so for the most part, we were just kind of under clothing of various sorts and able to be really quite comfortable. We actually had 2 of these with us. These are Eureka no bug zone tarps, and they were really fantastic. This is a smaller of the 2. We have a small one, and our colleagues that we were traveling with had a slightly larger one. And we cooked in here, we ate in here, we organized our data in here, we organized charging of our various electronic devices, we planned out the next day and hung out, socialized. And this actually made the whole trip so incredibly comfortable. It was kind of our living room and kitchen all in one. Because it had the tarp over the roof, then it was also a good shelter from rain. I don't think we got quite as much rain as William described, but we certainly got some wet days, and having that tarp roof over our heads was really nice as well. It meant we didn't have to constantly retreat to our tents and curl up into our sleeping bags every time the weather turned. And out in the field, I mean, it is an incredible thing to do this. I mean, I did it on my vacation, but it is still a bunch of work, and you do need to have a clear head about you in terms of planning the next day's field work. As you heard from William, you need to get up pretty early. We were getting up about 4:15 each day. So you don't want to be getting up at 4:15 and then working, oh, where am I going to go? Which point count am I going to do? Is there a particular species I should aim to try and get today? We really had to do all of that planning the evening or afternoon beforehand, and we'd organize our field notebook and write things out in detail there. And although we used our phones for documenting most of the birds and things, then there's also some things that you do kind of need to write down on a piece of paper as well. So having a bit of a structure laid out the night before, so simple things like writing out whatever tomorrow's date is and what the square number is and which point count you're actually going to go to in what order. Having that all prepared the night before is actually really helpful. And then, of course, once you're back from the field, then it's worth spending some time backing up that information. Notebooks that go out in the field do have a habit of disappearing into bogs and into rapids and under logs. So it's worth just taking the time to write out any crucial data from those notebooks. So I had a notebook in this middle photo that never left camp. That was the backup field data. And the scrappy one on the left with the multiple little buzzing friends on it is the one that we took out in the field. So this sounds like a bunch of work. It's really not that hard, but you do just need to pause and keep a clear head about it. And the rewards are you get to see some really cool things apart from just the birds. This is a lovely little Mystacini primrose that we had basically carpeting the ground around one of our camps, and they're beautiful, beautiful little wildflowers that you see in the far north along riverbank type habitat, and of course many other cool things that you get to see. I mentioned the kind of early starts, then you will become incredibly sleep deprived. This is Brent allegedly defending me from bears while I'm doing point counts. He's taking a well-deserved nap instead. But the rewards of this are that you're in these incredible habitats watching sunrise, and it's really hard to describe how much of a privilege that feels. So there's certainly some work, there's certainly some hardships and some discomforts, but the rewards are really difficult to describe. Just a little brief mention of some technology. So this is another arbitrary pretty view. This is one of our point counts, one gorgeous, gorgeous morning up on the muskeg habitat. This is a Zoom recording device. So these are little electronic recorders that we would take with us. Each time we did a point count, we'd kind of tie it up onto a tree if we could find one, or some kind of stick or something that was approximately human ear height off the ground. There's basically one button you need to press, and it will record the birds and the buzzing of the mosquitoes, and you can move your feet as well. It will record all of the sounds, so it essentially provides a little bit of a backup to each point count that you do. So of course, this is a piece of tech that takes a little bit of management. There were a few settings that you would have to check every single time you set it up, just to make sure none of the settings got switched when it was jammed in your pocket as you were hiking between point counts. Also runs on batteries. As it happened, we didn't actually have to recharge any batteries at all, so it was pretty straightforward, pretty low maintenance piece of tech that provided a backup to our point counts. We also had a couple of song meters, and William also mentioned these. So these are little units, maybe about, I don't know, 3 or 4 times the size of a cell phone, kind of volume-wise. And you would, again, attach these to trees in the afternoon or whenever, and using an app on your cell phone, you can set these going, document where you've actually deployed it, and they're pre-programmed to come on for a few minutes at dusk, and then again repeatedly during dawn. So it essentially does a bunch of automatic point counts. So it records the songs of birds and anything else that's making a noise for certain periods of time. So it actually really increases the amount of data that can be collected, because you can deploy these and then go off and do kind of manual point counts elsewhere. So again, these took a little bit of management. They run on batteries, they have memory cards in them, but actually we found over the 12-day trip, we didn't have to recharge the batteries, we didn't have to worry about the memory cards. We just need to kind of stick them on a tree and hope that a bear didn't eat them and come back and get them the next day or whenever it was we were moving on. I mentioned my cell phone a fair amount. We did use our cell phones. I'll get into that in a second. That was probably the main piece of tech that we needed to keep charged. And we've heard from William already. They did some solar charging as well, but it's worth being really proactive. Like whenever the sun is out, then grab it while you can, if you like. Make power while the sun shines, and be creative about where you can attach your solar panel to make sure you're charging things. If you have a nice easy paddle on a sunny day, you can even lay it out on your bags on the canoe. We hung it on our tent during rest days. A little bit more about gear, tips and tricks. So I mentioned the cell phone thing. So many people are a little bit confused about this, but if you have a smartphone, if you put it on airplane mode and battery saver mode as well, just check some settings, but the GPS that's built into most smartphones will still operate. So you can still use it to navigate, you can still use it to take waypoints, for example, of where you've deployed a song meter. Using some kind of mapping app, we happen to use a thing called Gaia GPS. You can use it to record tracks, you can use it to document where you tied the canoe up so that you can navigate back to it at the end of your point counts and things like that. It does become quite an essential piece of kit, especially if you're also using nature counts or eBird or iNaturalist, things like that, to document data in the field. So I always have mine attached to myself or something large that isn't going to get lost by a lanyard. Sounds really simple, but it's kind of an essential thing to do if you've got a whole trip's worth of data on this one precious little device. And we have these battery packs. We usually have a couple of these with us, and we can charge our phones kind of 4 or 5 times, depending on the size of the phone battery and the size of the battery pack. Then you'll get quite a few phone charges out of that. And then recharge the battery on sunny days so that you've always got your phone available to you. The cat did not come, although he possibly might have thought he wanted to come. And yeah, so once you're back within cell phone connectivity or Wi-Fi, then you can submit data from nature counts, eBird, iNaturalist, all of those kind of things. And once you're back within civilization, if you like, but back in cell phone range. But you can store all of that information on your phone for really quite extended backcountry trips as necessary. And yeah, so just to finalize, I mean, this was an incredible opportunity to collect data that is actually really important to help us better understand how we can use these landscapes, how we can protect certain areas, but also acknowledging that there is a lot of activity in these areas. There's a lot of people making livings out of these places, and lots of people that have lived there since time immemorial, as we've heard. So it was amazing to be able to contribute to projects that will hopefully mean that these kind of things can be done in a sustainable manner into the future. And yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions, and I hope to see you out on the river and at Atlas Encrypt next year. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. Are there any burning questions for our first two groups of panelists before we start talking about what you could do next year, this coming summer? So any questions out there, you can put them in the Q&As. So I'll just give a second here and see if we've got any questions coming up. All right, I'm not seeing any right now. I have a feeling we may have more at the end, but I'm quite confident that people are very inspired now and want to know how they can get involved this summer. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Karl Heide and Scott DeRoca, and they're going to be talking to us about what's available for the crew in 2022 or 2023. Karl served as crew lead for the Northern Paled Field crew in 2022 and is now working on the Atlas for planning the 2023 season. He completed his MSc at the University of Guelph in January of this year and has been involved with a number of long-term avian research projects across the world since 2013 and has been a serious birder since the age of 11. And Scott, if you want to give a few words about yourself, I didn't have a little bio for you, so that would be great. So I'm going to pass the baton over to you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I guess why don't I leave it up to Scott just to give a quick bio, and then I'll jump into what's showing on the screen here.
Thanks, Karl. I've been probably birding since 2016, and I've been working for I was working for the Toronto Region Conservation Authority doing wildlife inventories for them. And then I started working for the Atlas this summer that just passed, and I was working, I was part of their southern crew, so I was working in the Sudbury and Algonquin areas, and now I'm going to be working on the Atlas, just help planning for next year over the fall and winter.
Great, thanks. So in the interest of time, I'll go fairly quick here, but just want to cover some of the trips that we're planning for next summer, which we're very excited to be planning. So we hope that a lot of you will be interested in undertaking some of these adventures. First of all, last year we did 5 trips. We were a little bit hesitant because COVID was still quite rampant to go into some of these remote communities, but we did complete the Muketei, Mississa, Goki, Barrens, and Woodland Caribou, 2 of which were just talked about. For next year, we have 11 trips planned, 10 of which are shown here on this map. And most of them are in the Hudson Bay Lowlands area. There's a couple down in the Moosonee area and one in the upper Albany River. I'll just give a kind of a brief overview of the logistics of these trips. So for trip number 1 on that map, oh, let me just share my Google Earth screen. So trip number 1 on that map is the Little Sachigo Lake trip. That one would involve likely driving up to Pickle Lake here, which is kind of as far north as you can get on the road network, flying in by float plane into the community of Sachigo Lake, and then canoeing up into Little Sachigo Lake here, spending about 14 days atlasing and flying back out. Then we have the upper and lower Sachigo River trips. So for those ones, similarly, probably actually for those, it'll probably be flying from Sioux Lookout, which is down here, via commercial plane up into Sachigo Lake, float planing up into the upper Sachigo River area. Both of those trips will be approximately 2 weeks long, with a switch up here in the middle between them. And these, by the way, are the squares that will be covered on each trip. So each trip usually will have around 4 or 5 target squares, and these are squares that were priority or were covered in the last atlas, so that's why they're top priority to cover again next summer. The Fawn Severn trip will involve flying into the upper Fawn River area and canoeing down all the way to the coast at Fort Severn, where there'll be the opportunity as well to probably explore along the coast a bit and then fly back out to somewhere like Sioux Lookout, probably Sioux Lookout. What else do we have? The upper, I'll go with the upper Albany. So that one will be a little bit more straightforward, driving up into Nakina here, and then taking a relatively short float plane into Fort Hope, paddling downstream, which will take about 2 weeks to get down into this sort of Martin Falls area of the river, of the Albany River, and then float planing back to Nakina. Then we have the upper and lower Winnisk River. So the upper will involve flying into Webequie via float plane as well, canoeing down to the Winniscus Junction. That'll again be around 2 weeks. Most of these trips will take around 2 weeks to complete. And then float planing back out to likely to Nakina, which is again way down here. And then the lower Winnisk, similarly, we're not quite sure on the logistics of that one yet. Might be, most likely we'll be taking the train up into Moosonee, flying into Pewanak, and then being boated up the river and paddling back down river to the coast and exploring the coast a bit here. And then the Ekwon River trip, similarly, the crew will drive up to Cochrane, take the train to Moosonee, fly into Attawapiskat, and then do a guided tour of the Ekwon River and fly back out. And then for those who aren't able to complete these 2 week trips, but it might be interested in something a bit shorter, there's a couple of 1 week long trips that we're offering in the Moosonee area, which are a little bit closer to home, and maybe a little bit more accessible to people that don't have that much time and commitment. So coming down the Moose River from where the railroad hits the river around here, spending about a week coming down into Moosonee and then taking the train back to Cochrane would be one. And then the other one would be exploring the lower Moose River estuary and Ship Sands Islands Bird Sanctuary. So that's what we've got planned. Rather ambitious. We've already had quite a few people signing up, so that's great to see. And we expect there'll be a lot more interest. I'll just talk a little bit briefly here about kind of what we can expect. So last year, with the 5 trips that we ran, there were a few issues. Some people complained that things weren't as well organized as they could have been. There were a couple of instances of data getting lost. So these are things that we're looking to resolve for next year. We will be providing in-reach communication devices to each crew. These are satellite devices that can give you the peace of mind that you'll be able to communicate wherever you are. We'll be providing the canoes in most cases. If people have canoes they want to use, by all means, we'll consider that, but we should have the budget to cover the cost of canoes, including some pack canoes, which are these portable canoe in a box, basically, that you'll take with you on a commercial plane. So that'll allow for some of these trips not to use float planes as much, which will cut down on costs quite a bit. We'll cover the fees for all of your guides along the coast. There'll be polar bear guides wherever there are, wherever you're working in areas where there may be polar bear encounters. We will be covering the airfare to and from the remote community. And later this fall, we'll provide interested crews with a sort of trip package, which will include maps and protocols and that sort of thing, anything that you need to know to prepare kind of in advance what exactly you're going to be doing. And we're kind of still working on the data backup aspect of it, but we hope to have something available next year that'll be more reliable than what we had last year, to make sure that data don't ever get lost. Just want to go over kind of briefly the indigenous component of this. I mean, it's a huge component because basically all of these trips are on indigenous land. It's very important that wherever you are, you be respectful of the community that you're passing through and you're spending time in as guests there. I encourage you to all look at the nativeland.ca website, which has surprisingly detailed maps of the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples inhabiting all of Northern Ontario, and kind of do some research in advance for the trip that you're planning, in terms of whose lands you're on and where you're going to be passing through, and what are the significance of these rivers, of these ancient sacred territories. Take every opportunity to learn from those that you're with. So a lot of these trips will be entirely or partially guided by local Indigenous people, and those people will be eager and willing to help you learn about the history, the culture, and as well as the birds. And there's much knowledge about the birds in the area that you probably don't know yet, having never been there. So definitely listen to what those guides have to say about everything as you're passing through the area. And think about what you're a part of, in terms of research that is not just from the perspective of Western science, but also integrating more traditional scientific perspectives. There's a paper that I came across that's very interesting, and I would encourage anyone going on these trips to check out. And I put the QR code here for it. If you want to look it up, just take a moment to scan your phone on that and you can check that out. Very interesting stuff. Yeah, so without any, that's all I had. So if there's any other questions about any of that, we'd be happy to take it now. We don't have much time left in the Sappy Hour, but we will be here available to answer your questions in coming weeks, months.
Well, this is great. We have a few questions that we've answered in the Q&A chat, but we just thought we would let people know what those questions were in case it's one of your questions. Somebody wanted to know if you had to ask everyone for their weight, which, that could be a touchy issue. And Mark said, no, everybody was weighed together, but they were sure they came back a little bit later. And somebody was asking what ARU stand for. That's that automated recording unit. Your photos were fantastic, Mhairi. Yours and Brent's and that was definitely appreciated. They wanted to know who took the photos. And then someone asked a really good question about who was from Sioux Lookout, and wanted to know if the high water this spring affected your trips. And Mark didn't seem to see an impact, but he wondered if it had an impact on some of the water birds. And Mhairi said on their trip, they had a tough time paddling across and slightly upstream on some places because it was very high and powerful. The waterfall levels had fallen a little bit for us, but we did find plenty of space on the banks to put up their tents. All right, so we have a few questions that are here now. So somebody wants to know what kind of financial commitment is required to participate in the trips.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I can
Go
tell
ahead,
you from
sir.
our perspective, the Atlas is very generous with supporting these teams. We had to be responsible for sort of getting up to Red Lake and getting to where we were flying out in and out of. We had to get our own food, but then the Atlas covered off almost everything else for us. So it was probably well less than half the price of trying to do it on our own. And it was this wonderful opportunity to see a part of the province that we would never get to see otherwise. You're on mute.
Sorry. Someone was also saying that on the Barrens, high water did affect them. They had to cut new portages around previously runnable rapids and found campsites flooded. So there was some people who were impacted by the high water. This is another question here. We have some experience traveling in the northern communities and are happy to offer support while you travel through Sioux Lookout. And they have some burning interest and expertise. So that's nice to know. Taylor Brown's asking, how many people roughly are you still looking to recruit for all of the 2023 trips combined?
Probably looking for at least another 30 to 40 people, I would say, just a rough ballpark. But yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've had I think around close to 10 people confirming that they are interested for next year.
Okay. There's a follow-up question to this last one. Also, does one need to be an expert level at Songbird song ID for these trips?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and take that one. That
Sure.
we don't require that everybody on the trip be an expert birder. We want at least 2 expert birders, folks who could do point counts. But it isn't necessary that everybody does. It's certainly helpful if everybody. Well, it's important that everybody be comfortable and experienced in wilderness situations, and certainly capable of dealing with canoes and working in remote areas.
Okay.
And I should say that, yeah, the Zoom, it's feasible for people who don't know birds well by song to do the Zoom point counts without any trouble. We don't necessarily need somebody to do point counts live. We can get them done on the using the Zoom units alone. So you can keep that in mind.
All right, we have one last question here. What advice would you give to those who are interested in participating in a trip and have had some experience birding and in the outdoors, but aren't necessarily experts in either of the two?
Well, I think some of the stuff that Mhairi suggested earlier, that say the whitewater canoeing course that Madawaska Canoe Center does, or some of the other groups, it would be really useful to have that experience to try and get in on that before doing a trip if you haven't got the experience. And otherwise, yeah, just learning as much as you can about the birds before you go. When you apply, we haven't mentioned it yet, but most people probably know there's an application on the website that you can fill in that tells us information about yourselves. We're undoubtedly going to give priority to the people that are most experienced, that have the wilderness experience, that have the birding experience. But we're looking for a lot of people, so we're going to do some mixing and matching, I'm sure, to try and make sure we can get a full suite of teams very capable of safely doing this work.
All right, so we have one more question here. If we had a group of 4 paddlers / birders, would an experienced guide / polar bear decoy be added to the group?
Well, it depends where you go. It's really only within about 100 kilometers of the Hudson Bay coast and the northern James Bay coast that there's the concern about polar bears. So if you're doing, say, some of those trips on the upper parts of the Sashigo or the upper parts of the Winisk, you wouldn't need guides with you at all. But when you're getting down to the coastal areas, we're going to make arrangements that there will be guides with people working in those areas. It's unusual for polar bears to be in the area until after mid-July, and atlasing's usually finished well before that, but we don't want to take any chances. So we'll be trying to make arrangements for that as much as we can.
All right.
Sarah, can I just ask our anonymous attendee from Sioux Lookout saying that they could help with folks who are passing through the Sioux Lookout area, if you could maybe drop us a line and let us know who you are. If you don't want to reveal it in the chat, then please just email Kaylin at atlas@birdsontario.org, or yeah, that'd probably be the easiest way, and just let us know so we can contact you, because it could be really helpful to have somebody in Sioux Lookout that knows the ropes.
I think they may have put their name in afterwards.
Okay.
Might have done it again. But yeah, but
they just said they're going to contact you. So
perfect. Yep.
We're good to go. All right. Well, it's 8 o'clock, folks. And I think we're done for the evening. Oh, somebody would like us to put the link to the application in the chat.
Yep, I pasted it in the chat. It's the birdsontario.org/northern-trips. So it should be in the chat there.
Wonderful. And a big thank you from the person who asked that. So are there any other burning questions before we wrap it up for the evening? Yep, let's give it a second or two. All right. Well, I'm going to thank everyone on our panel for being here tonight. You're a great bunch to work with, as always. Great presentations, and I think you've inspired a lot of people to give a hard look at doing one of these northern experiences. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined us this evening. And stay tuned, and we'll have another Sappy Hour coming up soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.